The sun was a hammer on the back of Ethan's neck as he rode along the dry creek bed. This was his land, or at least the bank said it was. For 5 years, he'd fought this piece of Texas earth. It was a fight he was losing. The dirt was pale and cracked, like old bones. His few cattle were gone, sold off bit by bit, until only one tough old longhorn remained, standing in the shade of a sickly mesquite tree. His cabin, a small thing he'd built with his own blistered hands, seemed to sag a little more each day. Hope was as scarce as water. He wasn't looking for trouble. He was just looking for a sign, any sign, that things could get better. Maybe a damp spot in the creek bed, maybe a patch of grass he'd missed. His horse, a dusty gelding as tired as he was, plodded along with its head low. The world was quiet, too quiet. Just the creak of his saddle, the buzz of flies, and the whisper of a hot wind. That's when he saw the first stain. A dark, rusty splash on the gray dirt. He reined in, squinting. It was blood, already baked into the earth. His whole body went tight. Blood meant trouble a wounded animal, or worse. He looked around, his hand drifting to the old rifle in its scabbard. Nothing moved. He should have turned back. Every sensible bone in his body told him to ride home, bolt the door, and mind his own dying business. But the trail was there, a few drops here, a smudge there, leading off the creek and up into a rocky draw. Someone or something was badly hurt. With a sigh that came from his boots, he nudged his horse forward, following the quiet. Red dots dot the draw was narrow, walls of crumbling sandstone rising on either side. The smell hit him first, the coppery tongue of blood, and the sweet, sick smell of infection. Then he saw a flash of color against the brown rock. It was a piece of cloth, deep blue, decorated with tiny, intricate beads. He dismounted slowly, his boots crunching on the gravel. He moved forward, step by careful step, until he could see around a large boulder. She was curled there, in a small patch of shadow. A young woman, her long dark hair matted with sweat and dirt. She wore a deerskin dress, torn and stained. Her face was turned away, but he could see the tense line of her shoulder, the way she held herself tight against the pain. And then he saw the wound. High on her shoulder, a ugly, angry mess. A gunshot. It wasn't fresh. The edges were inflamed, a nasty yellow seeping through. She was burning up with fever. He must have made a sound, a sharp intake of breath, because her eyes flew open. They were dark, wide with pain and a fear, so sharp it felt like a physical thing in the air between them. She tried to push herself back against the rock, a low animal sound escaping her lips. She was Comanche. That fact landed in his gut like a stone. Stories of raids, of terrible violence, flashed through his mind. This was the enemy, their eyes locked. In hers, he saw the desperate will to live, the terror of being found, the fading fire of a spirit that wasn't ready to go out. In that moment, she wasn't a Comanche warrior or a symbol of fear. She was just a person, a young woman, dying alone in a hot, dusty hole. His own loneliness answered hers. He thought of his empty cabin, his silent days, the way he'd started talking to the old longhorn just to hear a voice. He had nothing left to lose, and she was about to lose everything. He knelt down, keeping his movements slow. He showed her his empty hands. "Easy now," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "I'm not gonna hurt you." She didn't understand the words, but maybe she understood the tone. She watched him, every muscle trembling, her breath coming in short, hot gasps. He knew he couldn't leave her. The fever would kill her by nightfall, or the wolves would come. The decision, once made, felt simple. He took a step closer. She flinched, but was too weak to pull away. He carefully slid one arm under her knees, the other behind her back. She was light, too light. She cried out as he lifted her, a short, sharp sound of agony that she bit off halfway through. He carried her, as gently as he could, back to his horse. Getting her onto the saddle was a struggle. He ended up mounting first, then pulling her up in front of him, holding her tight against his chest to keep her from falling. She was limp now, the last of her strength gone. Her head lolled against his shoulder. He could feel the terrible heat of her fever through his shirt. The ride back to his cabin was the longest mile of his life. Every jolt of the horse made her whimper. He talked to her the whole way, nonsense words, just to fill the silence. Almost there now. You just hang on. Gonna get you fixed up. He didn't know if he was trying to comfort her or himself. Finally, the sorry shape of his cabin came into view. He carried her inside, into the dim one-room space. He laid her on his own rough bed, the only soft thing he owned. He built a small fire, heated water, and found the last of his precious whiskey. This was going to be the hard part. He cleaned the wound as best he could. She fought him, weakly, when the whiskey touched her torn flesh, her fingers clawing at his arm. He held her down, his jaw clenched, whispering apologies she couldn't understand. When it was done, he wrapped the wound in a clean strip of cloth from an old shirt. He gave her sips of water, which she finally took, her eyes never leaving his face. Night fell. The fever took hold fully. She tossed and turned, muttering words in a language he didn't know. He sat on the dirt floor beside the bed, a wet cloth in his hand, bathing her face. He felt a responsibility he hadn't asked for, a connection to this stranger that was deeper than fear. In the flickering firelight, as he fought to keep her in this world, he realized something. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about his failing ranch, his debts, or his own misery. He had a single, clear purpose: keep this girl alive. And in that purpose, he found a shred of the cabin was too quiet, and yet too loud with the sounds of her suffering. The woman, he still didn't know her name, lay on his bed, caught in the grip of the fever. Her breathing was a raspy, uneven thing. Ethan sat on a rickety stool he'd pulled close, a tin cup of water in one hand, a damp cloth in the other. He felt completely out of his depth. He'd sewn up cuts from barbed wire, dealt with a busted rib once, but this was different. This was a gunshot, and the infection that came with it was a silent, spreading poison. He'd done what he could. The wound was clean now, wrapped in a strip of faded blue calico from an old shirt. But the real enemy was inside her, cooking her from within. He dipped the cloth in the water and gently wiped her forehead. Her skin was hot and dry. She flinched at the touch, her eyes flying open. They were glassy, unfocused, seeing things he couldn't see. He said, his voice low and soft, the way he'd talk to a spooked horse. Just me, you're all right. She didn't understand the words, of course. Her gaze darted around the shadowy room, over the rough log walls, the empty hearth, the single shelf with a few cans of beans. It was a poor place, a desperate place. Maybe she understood that. A flicker of something, not fear, but assessment passed through her eyes before the fever pulled her under again. He tried to give her more water. Most of it trickled down her chin, but a little went in. He saw her throat work as she swallowed. It was a small victory dot night pressed in around the cabin. The wind picked up, whining under the door. Ethan lit a single candle, the small flame pushing back the darkness just a few feet. He didn't dare sleep. He kept the watch, listening to her breathe. Sometimes she would mutter, the words flowing in a language that was all sharp edges and soft rhythms. Once her hand moved, her fingers tracing a pattern in the air, as if drawing something important. He found himself talking to her, not because she could hear, but because the silence was too heavy. "Don't know how you ended up out there," he murmured, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. Guess it don't matter much now. You're here. I'm here. Funny, ain't it? This old cabin hasn't had another soul in it for years. Just me in the dust. He told her about the ranch, or what was left of it. He talked about the drought, about the well that ran dry, about the last of his cattle. He spoke of the loneliness, a thing so constant it had become like a second skin. It was easier to say these things to someone who couldn't understand. It was like talking to the moon. I almost didn't stop, he confessed, the words tasting bitter. Saw the blood. Thought, Ethan, that's trouble walking. You got enough trouble. But I just couldn't ride on. Felt like leaving a wounded dog. No offense. Just before dawn, her fever broke. It happened suddenly. 1 minute she was burning up, tossing and turning. The next a deep, full-body shudder went through her, and she went still. A fine sweat beaded on her skin. Her breathing, for the first time, became deep and even. She fell into a true sleep, not a fever dream. Ethan let out a long breath he didn't know he'd been holding. The tension in his own shoulders eased a little. He added a little wood to the fire, just enough to take the chill off the room. When the first gray light of morning filtered through the single window, her eyes opened again. This time they were clear. She was present. She looked at him, then slowly, carefully, took in the room again. He saw her remember. The pain, the draw, being carried. She looked down at the clean bandage on her shoulder, then back at him. He didn't move. He just gave a small, slow nod. Morning, he said that. She was silent for a long time. Her eyes were intelligent, missing nothing. They lingered on his worn boots, his thin face, the empty corn sack in the corner. She saw his poverty as clearly as he saw her strength. Finally, she spoke. Her voice was weak, but clear. A single word. It sounded like, "Tayi?" He blinked, "Tayi?" She nodded slightly, then touched her own chest. Tayi, it was her name. A gift of trust, small but immense. He nodded again, a little awkwardly. He touched his own chest. Ethan. "E, then?" she repeated, the sound careful in her mouth. He moved slowly to get her some more water and a piece of hardtack biscuit. He showed her each thing before offering it. She took the water, drank deeply, and studied the biscuit before taking a small bite. She was fierce in her weakness, like a cornered hawk that wasn't ready to quit Dot as the morning grew. He helped her sit up, propping her against the wall with his rolled-up blanket. She watched his every move, her dark eyes following him as he tidied up the few things in the cabin. He felt like he was being weighed and measured. He wasn't sure if he was passing the test. He went outside to check on his horse and that one old longhorn. When he came back in, he saw she had managed to reach the small table by the bed. On its dusty surface, with a bit of water from her cup, she had drawn a simple picture. It was a circle with lines coming out of it, like a sun. Next to it, she'd drawn a crude horse and rider. She pointed to the sun, then to herself. Tayi. Then she pointed to the horse and rider, looked at him, and made a questioning sound. He understood. She was asking how she got here. He pointed to himself, then mimed riding a horse, then carefully lifting something and carrying it. He pointed to her, then to the bed. She watched his pantomime, her expression unreadable. Then she looked at the drawing of the sun, and a shadow passed over her face. Not fear of him, but something else. A deep, worried sorrow. She looked toward the window, toward the vast, open land beyond his cabin. Ethan followed her gaze. The peaceful morning felt fragile now. He had saved her from the wound and the fever. But he understood, sitting there in the quiet, that he might have pulled her out of one danger and into another. He was a man alone, and she was a woman who belonged somewhere else, to people who would be looking for her. People who would see this cabin not as a refuge, but as a target. The weight of what he had done settled on him, heavier than before. It wasn't just about keeping her alive anymore. It was about what happened next. The next morning was clear and still. Ethan went about his few chores with a new kind of watchfulness. His eyes kept drifting to the horizon, scanning the empty, rolling land. Tai was stronger. She could sit up on her own now, and she ate the thin porridge he made without help. But the quiet between them was filled with things neither could say. She would look out the window, her face tense, listening to sounds he couldn't hear. She was waiting for something. He knew it, and it made the skin on the back of his neck prickle. He tried to go through the motions of a normal day. He checked on the old longhorn, which was standing in the same patch of shade as always. He hauled a bucket of muddy water from the nearly dry creek, a chore that felt more pointless than ever. Every time he bent to a task, he found himself straightening up again after a minute, his eyes searching the distance. Just past noon, the feeling became a sound. A low, dull rumble, like far-off thunder on a perfectly clear day. He froze, a bucket in his hand. Tai's head snapped toward the door. Her eyes were wide, not with fear, but with a fierce, bright recognition. And dread. The rumble grew, resolving into a steady, rhythmic drumming. Hooves, not a few horses. Many. Ethan dropped the bucket. The water soaked into the thirsty dirt without a sound. He walked slowly to the edge of his sagging porch, his heart hammering against his ribs so hard he felt dizzy. There, on the western rise, they appeared, a line of riders. They seemed to rise up out of the earth itself, dark shapes against the bright sky. They kept coming more and more until the whole horizon seemed to be moving. The drumming of hooves became a storm of sound, shaking the ground under his feet. Dust billowed up behind him like a brown cloud, swallowing the sun. This was it. The consequence. He looked back into the cabin. Tai was struggling to get to her feet, one hand pressed against her bandaged shoulder. Her face was pale. She said one word, sharp and clear. It sounded like Pia. Father. Ethan's mouth went dry. He thought of his rifle, leaning against the wall inside the door. The idea of reaching for it was a joke. 1 shot against 30? It would only be an excuse for what would come next. He made a decision, swift and cold. If this was the end, he would not meet it by pointing a gun at a father looking for his daughter. He pushed the cabin door shut, leaving the rifle inside. He stepped away from the porch into the open yard and raised his empty hands high. The warriors fanned out with a terrible, practiced grace. They did not charge. They simply flowed into position, surrounding the cabin, the corral, the well, cutting off every path. They were silent. The only sound was the snorting of their horses and the jingle of bridles. Their faces were painted with streaks of ochre and white, making them look like spirits of the earth itself. Stern and unforgiving. At their head was a man on a powerful paint horse. He was older, his face lined like old leather, but he sat straight as a knife blade. His hair was long, with feathers woven into it. This was no young raider. This was a leader. His eyes, dark and piercing, swept over the scene, the dying ranch, the pathetic cabin, a lone man with his hands in the air. Those eyes missed nothing. They settled on Ethan, and the weight of that gaze felt like a physical force. The leader dismounted. He did not hurry. He handed his reins to a younger man and walked forward. He carried no weapon in his hands, but his authority was a weapon enough. The other warriors watched, still as statues. Ethan forced his feet to stay planted. Every instinct screamed to run, to hide, to explain. He did none of it. He just stood, his hands trembling slightly in the air, meeting the older man's stare. The man stopped a few paces away, Up close, Ethan could see the intensity in his eyes, a deep, burning anger held under iron control. This was a man who had ridden hard, fearing the worst. Ethan had to speak. He lowered his hand slowly, pointing a shaking finger toward the cabin door. "The woman," he said, his voice cracking. He cleared his throat. "Inside. She is hurt." He mimed a gunshot to his own shoulder, then pointed again at the cabin. "I helped." The man, Iron Hawk, said nothing. He didn't even blink. He simply stared at Ethan for a heartbeat longer, then strode past him. He pushed the cabin door open and stepped inside, into the dimness. The world seemed to stop. Ethan stood in the yard, surrounded by 30 silent warriors. He could feel their eyes on him, could hear the soft stamp of a hoof. A horse blew out its breath. Time stretched out, thin and terrible. What was happening in there? Was Tai speaking? Was she crying? Was he seeing the bandage, the clean bed, the care? Or was he only seeing a white man's walls around his daughter? Ethan looked at the ground, at the dust his own boots had stirred. This was his whole life, this dust, this failure. And now it would end here. He found, to his surprise, that he wasn't afraid of dying. He was afraid that Tai would think he had betrayed her, that his clumsy help would be seen as a crime. Then the door opened. Iron Hawk emerged. His face was changed. The sheer, fiery anger was gone, replaced by a profound, unreadable stillness. He looked at Ethan, then turned and spoke a few low words to a warrior who had dismounted. This younger man stepped forward. He had a scar across his cheek, but his eyes were keen. Iron Hawk spoke. The young warrior listened, then turned to Ethan. His English was broken, but clear. "You take her blood in your house?" he asked, his voice flat. Ethan nodded. "Yes, I found her in the draw, bleeding. The fever was bad." "You give water? Food?" "Yes." The young warrior studied him. "Why? You steal her?" The question hung in the air. Ethan shook his head, a sudden, hot frustration cutting through his fear. He gestured wildly at his ranch, at the single skinny cow, the dry well, the patchy roof. "Look at this place," he said, his voice rising. "What do I have to steal for? She was dying. I was there." He ran out of words, his hands falling to his sides. The young warrior translated. Iron Hawk's eyes moved slowly over Ethan's meager holdings. He saw the truth of it. The poverty was too complete to be a lie. This was not the lodge of a powerful enemy. This was the hole of a desperate man. Iron Hawk took a step closer. He looked into Ethan's face, searching for something. He saw the exhaustion, the loneliness, the honest bewilderment of a man caught in a storm not of his making. He saw the lack of guile. The leader reached out. He did not offer a handshake. Instead, he placed his hand firmly on Ethan's shoulder. His grip was strong enough to crush bone, but it was not an attack. It was a test, a measure of the man's spirit. Ethan did not pull away. He met the older man's gaze and held it. After a long moment, Iron Hawk's hand tightened once, then fell away. He spoke to the young warrior, his tone final. The warrior nodded. He looked at Ethan, and for the first time, his expression wasn't hard. There was something like respect, or maybe just understanding. "You have a poor ranch," the warrior said, translating his chief's words. "But you have a strong heart. You saved my daughter's song." He paused, letting the words sink in. "We will save your water." Ethan stared, not comprehending. Iron Hawk turned and barked a series of orders. And then the warriors dismounted. Not to burn, or loot, or kill. They simply got off their horses. Some began to unsaddle them. Others walked toward the dry creek bed, pointing and talking. 2 younger men approached the crumbling well, examining its stone rim. They were staying. For a long moment, Ethan just stood there, his mind unable to catch up with what his eyes were seeing. The warriors were not attacking. They were working. 2 of the younger men were already pulling old, dry brush away from the base of his crumbling well. Another was walking a slow, careful pattern away from the creek bed. His eyes on the ground, Ironhawk turned and gave a short, sharp command toward the cabin. The door opened, and Tyee appeared, standing tall despite her bandaged shoulder. Her father looked at her, and the stern lines of his face softened for just a second. He said a single word. She nodded and walked toward him, not looking at Ethan. A woman who had ridden with the warriors older, with a quiet, strong face came forward and gently guided Tyee to a shaded spot by the corral, speaking to her in low tones. She was being cared for by her own people now. The young warrior with the scar, who seemed to be the translator, approached Ethan again. He says you show where water was, where it went. Ethan blinked, then nodded, coming out of his daze. He led the way to the dry creek bed, the warrior and Ironhawk following. He pointed to the shallow, sandy groove. It used to run here, spring and early summer. Slowed to a trickle, then nothing. For 2 months now, nothing. Ironhawk knelt, scooping up a handful of the fine, dry sand. He let it sift through his fingers, then looked not at the creek bed itself, but at the lay of the land beyond it, at the way the hills rose in the distance. He spoke. He says water is not gone, the young man translated. It is shy. It has gone deeper, found a new path under the earth. You dig in the wrong place. Ironhawk stood and walked with a purpose away from the creek, heading toward a rocky outcrop about 100 yards away. It was a place Ethan had always ignored, just a jumble of sandstone and scrub. The old man stopped at its base, where a few stubborn, green-leafed plants grew, unlike the brittle grass everywhere else. He pointed at the plants, then at a faint, damp-looking stain on the rock in the shade. Here, the translator said simply. Ethan felt a flicker of doubt. He'd dug for water before, with back-breaking effort, and found only more dust. But Ironhawk's certainty was absolute. The leader called out, and 4 men came over with hatchets and strong digging sticks. They didn't ask questions. They just started to dig, right where the old man had pointed. The rhythm of the ranch changed completely. The silence was filled with the sound of chopping at roots, the scrape of stone, the low murmur of voices. Some of the warriors tended to the large herd of horses, leading them in small groups to drink from the leather water bags they carried. Others gathered dry wood and built a second, larger fire near the corral. The smell of cooking meat venison from a recent hunt began to mix with the dust. Ethan's empty stomach clenched. He couldn't remember the last time he'd smelled food so good. He felt useless in his own home. He moved to help the men digging, but one of them just shook his head and handed him a water bag instead, pointing to the workers. His job was to carry water for them. It was a humble task, but it was something. As he carried the bag from man to man, he saw their efficiency. They worked in turns, not wasting energy, the hole growing steadily deeper. Back near the cabin, he saw Tyee watching the diggers too. The older woman was applying a fresh poultice of mashed herbs to her shoulder. Tyee's eyes met Ethan's across the yard. There was no smile, but the deep worry was gone from her face. She gave him a single, slow nod. It was thanks. It was acknowledgement. He nodded back, a knot of tension in his chest, loosening just a little dot as the afternoon sun began to lower. A shout came from the hole. It wasn't a shout of alarm, but of discovery. The men inside were muddy to their waists. Ethan hurried over and peered down. 4 feet down, the dirt had changed color from pale brown to a dark, rich black. And at the bottom, Glinting in the shadow was a patch of wet mud. Not a lot, but it was wet. Ironhawk looked down, grunted in satisfaction, and issued more orders. The men redoubled their efforts, now carefully shaping the hole, using flat stones from the outcrop to line the sides. The translator came and stood next to Ethan. "It is a spring," he said. "Slow, but strong. It will fill. It will not run dry like the creek." Ethan looked from the muddy hole to the serious face of the young warrior. "Why?" he asked, the word bursting out of him. "Why are you doing this?" The young man watched his people work for a moment before answering. "Tay's life has worth. You return something of great worth. My people do not let a debt hang in the air like a bad smell. We settle it." He glanced at Ethan. "You saved her song. Now your land will have a song too. The water song." As evening fell, the spring began to fulfill its promise. Clear, cold water was slowly seeping in, filling the bottom of the stone-lined hole. One of the warriors, with a craftsman's skill, used a hot stone and a hollowed-out length of green wood to create a simple pipe, channeling the water into a steady, gentle trickle that spilled onto the thirsty ground. That night, Ethan did not eat alone by his lonely fire. He was given a place by the larger fire. A piece of roasted venison, rich and hot, was handed to him on a slab of bark. He ate until he was full, a feeling so foreign it was almost uncomfortable. He listened to the talk and laughter around him, not understanding a word, but understanding the feeling. It was the sound of people resting after honest work. Ironhawk sat across the fire, speaking quietly with Ty and the older women. Once he looked up and his eyes found Ethan's. He didn't smile, but he raised his chin slightly, a gesture of recognition. Ethan, not knowing what else to do, raised his own chin in return. Later, as he lay on his bedroll outside his cabin door, he had given the cabin to the women for the night. He stared up at the stars. The earth beneath him seemed different. It was no longer a dead thing sucking the life out of him. The quiet trickle of water from the new spring was the only sound in the night. It was a tiny sound, but it changed everything. It was a promise. The land wasn't dead. It had just been waiting, like the water, for someone who knew how to listen. The morning light felt different. It wasn't the harsh, accusing glare Ethan had woken to for years. It was softer, and the air carried a new sound, the steady, gentle trickle of water from the spring into the small stone basin the warriors had built. He rose from his bedroll and saw the camp was already awake and moving with a quiet purpose. The women were packing bundles. The warriors were checking their horses' hooves and tightening saddle cinches. They were leaving. A strange emptiness opened up inside Ethan. The place had been so full of life and activity for a day, and now it would return to silence. He walked over to the new spring, just to watch the water flow, to make sure it was real. Ironhawk stood there, already dressed for travel. He watched the water for a moment, then looked at Ethan. He pointed to the spring, then made a wide, sweeping gesture that took in Ethan's whole patch of land. He spoke a few words. His meaning was clear. Asterisk, this is yours now. Protect it. Asterisk, Ethan nodded. I will. The young translator walked up, leading 2 horses. We go now, he said. He looked at the spring, a hint of pride in his eyes. The water will grow stronger. In 3 days, it will be full. You can lead your cow here. You can grow things. Thank you, Ethan said, and the words felt terribly small for the gift he'd been given. The young man shrugged. It is just water. The gift was the life. He glanced toward where Ty stood with the older women, then back at Ethan, his expression turning more serious. The men who shot her, they were not from a village. They were Taibo white men, like you, but with bad hearts, hunters. They shot from far away for no reason. She was looking for medicine plants. Ethan felt a cold knot form in his stomach. It was a senseless act of cruelty, the kind that started wars and filled graves. He understood now the depth of Ironhawk's fear when he arrived, and the greater depth of his gratitude. The young man continued, his voice low. Because of this, there is danger. Those men may come back through this land. You live in a lonely place. My chief says to keep your eyes open. You have a strong heart, but a strong heart is not arrow-proof. It was a warning, but it was also a strange kind of trust. They were telling him their troubles. Ta, why I broke away from the women and walked over. She moved with much more strength now, her head held high. She stopped in front of Ethan. She was no longer the feverish girl he'd carried from the draw. She was a young woman of her people, composed and sure. She looked at him, and then she did something he didn't expect. She placed her hand lightly over her own heart, then extended it, palm open, toward his. It was a simple, graceful gesture. No words were needed. The thanks were in her eyes, clear and direct. Good luck, Ethan, she said, carefully sounding out his name. And to you, Tai, he replied. She gave him one last, long look, then turned and walked to the horse a warrior held for her. She mounted easily, without help, settling into the saddle as if she were part of the animal. Ironhawk gave a final command. In a fluid motion, the entire party mounted up. They did not look like a war party anymore. They looked like a family, a community, moving on. Ironhawk raised a hand, not in a wave, but in a kind of saluted gesture between equals. Ethan raised his own hand in return. Then they,